Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome to the Networking RX podcast. I'm your host, Frank Agan, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. Today, we have a guest with us, Gleb Tsipursky. Did I say that right, Gleb?
You did. Thank you, Frank.
All right. I've been practicing, let me put at the end of that, PhD, and he just might be the smartest person we've ever had on the Networking RX. Not just today.
Thank you.
All of my guests are smarter than me. That's a low bar, but it's a requirement. All guests have to be smarter than me. But seriously, you have quite a background. Gleb is a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist, and he's the author of 3 books. Actually 4, now that I understand. He came out with one on a flash back in May, June. I think he called Resilience.
Yes, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 Coronavirus Pandemic. As you can imagine, I wrote it very quickly because my publisher came to me and said, hey, do you want to write this book, address the pandemic, and being my expertise is in cognitive biases, risk management, disaster avoidance. And I'm like, sure, let's do it.
Yeah. So that's out there. And when I got Gleb to agree to come on my podcast, that was just that he had just been it started and all that. But anyhow, his other books are Never Go With Your Gut: How Pioneering Leaders Make the Best Decisions and Avoid Business Disasters, The Truth Seeker's Handbook, a Science-Based Guide, and The Blind Spot Between Us: How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships. He's truly, I heard him speak. That's where I stumbled across him, but he's truly a thought leader. Been featured in hundreds of articles and interviews with media notables such as Fast Company, CBS News, Time, Scientific American, Psychology Today, which is my favorite, The Conversation, Business Insider, The Chronicle of Philanthropy, Government Executive, and Inc. magazine, just to name a few. I mean, again, hundreds of these things that I was able to find. But he is known as a disaster avoidance expert, and in his work, he intends to help leaders not make dangerous judgment errors. We're going to talk about that, and these are known as cognitive biases, because these biases they can devastate a bottom line or seriously impair someone's career. And again, we'll talk about all this. His work literally takes him around the world. He's worked with hundreds of clients, including mid-sized companies, large not-for-profits, corporate giants like Honda, Wells Fargo, and Xerox. And he comes to this work with a foundation of over 15 years in higher education, including 7 as a professor at the Ohio State universities. And he's also has dozens of peer-reviewed academic publications in journals such as Behavior and Social Issues and Journal of Social and Political Psychology. Quite a background, Gleb, quite a background. Welcome to the Networking RX.
Thank you, Frank. I really appreciate you inviting me, and I'm glad we stumbled into each other during that talk.
Oh,
Look
absolutely.
forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I indicated, well, I will tell people that at the talk, he handed out his book, Don't Go With Your Gut, Never Go With Your Gut. And I had it, and I have a friend, a franchisee, who's writing a book all about going with your gut intuition. I said, before you write another word, you need to read this book. And so I sent that copy off to him. I hope I didn't torpedo his whole plan, but it's good to know. Anyhow, this podcast is focused on making the best of our professional relationships, i.e. business networking. And much of our listening audience is entrepreneurs, sales reps, and professionals. I know you've talked to those sorts all the time. But with that, my opening question is what is cognitive bias and why does it matter? That's the holy grail of questions here.
It is the holy grail of questions. Well, the cognitive biases are the specific dangerous judgment errors we make because of how our brain is wired. That's the simple thing. Unfortunately, our brain is not wired for the modern environment. That is what we have learned in recent research. So folks who say, go with your gut, trust your intuition, Malcolm Gladwell who says blink, or Tony Robbins who says be primal or be savage, they're basically telling you to act like a primitive the ancestor of ours who lived in the savannah, ancestral savannah, when we were hunter-gatherers living in small tribes of 15 people to 150 people. Now think about that. Tribalism was incredibly important to us. Tribalism was fundamental to who we were. So that was the fundamental basis of how we built our relationships. With small tribes of people who looked like us, who thought like us, had the same values that we do, everything like that. So we're inherently very tribal, because if we weren't sufficiently tribal, we'd be kicked out of our tribe and we'd die, or our tribe would fall apart and then we'd die, or we wouldn't protect it sufficiently against an invading enemy tribe and then we'd still die. Notice, we're the descendants of those people who didn't die.
Right.
Therefore, we are very tribal as a result. In the modern environment, that caused us to make so many errors because we don't live in a tribal environment. We live in a very complex global society, civilization. So you need to change your behaviors from those natural, primitive, savage ones to civilized ones. Civilized, of course, just means adapted to the modern civilization. And people who tell you to go with your gut are people who tell you to be primal and savage. It just doesn't work in the modern environment. It's a bad idea. And the tribalism is only one out of many aspects of how our brain is miswired to cause us to fall into dangerous judgment errors. But tribalism relating to relationships is one of the most important areas. And there are so many dynamics around tribalism that we can talk about, as well as other areas that really damage our relationships. So whether you are an entrepreneur who wants to evaluate a new business partner, or a salesperson who wants to make an effective sale, these are all things that are much more difficult to do if you follow your gut, as opposed to check your gut for various errors that you're likely to make and then deliberately adopt more civilized behaviors that will get you to the goal, your relationship goal.
So I guess to clarify, it's okay to go with my gut when I'm at a restaurant deciding to order between A and B, but when you're talking about don't go with your gut relative to relationships, and I think that's the important distinction, because I've gotten into debates with people over this and like, oh no, you need to trust your gut. And it's like, yeah, I get it when it's the choice between, the chicken or the beef. But when we're talking about people, we need to kind of put that aside. That's really kind of what you're getting at.
I'm exactly getting at that. And there wouldn't be a Networking RX podcast if everyone was great at networking, right?
Right.
That means that's a very simple way of demonstrating that there wouldn't be need for professional development in sales, there wouldn't be need for professional development in relationship building if we were just great with following our intuitions, our gut reactions, and we just form relationships in a wonderful way. Yeah, it doesn't matter what you order in a restaurant. That's not the essence of what we're talking about. What matters is what kind of interactions you have between people. And with other people, it's very dangerous to fall into these cognitive biases.
So, much of what you're getting at here involves, again, our, the ongoing primitive brain, the part of the brain that's really super fast, but it's primitive. And then you have the newer, more sophisticated part of the brain that's slower.
That's right.
I look at it's like two people. You had that friend in high school. He was fast and dim-witted and always said something, got everybody in trouble. And that's kind of the slow part of the brain. And you wanted to be that slower, more polished friend. And what's happening is the first is getting the second one in trouble, is what it sounds like. So
that's a good analogy, except you want to think about this friend who you have, the slow, dim-witted friend, as incredibly big and powerful, and you as a tiny little nerd who is able to get this person out of trouble. Because that part of our brain, the emotional part, it's also called the lizard brain, the system 1, I call it the autopilot system because we react automatically. That's our automatic intuitive reactions. The autopilot system is much more powerful. It reacts in milliseconds, and it can really screw up you from preventing you from making the good decisions. The rational, abstract, logical part of our brain is much weaker. It's much less powerful. and it can correct the mistakes of that very quick, very automatic system, very powerful system. But you need to know that the autopilot system makes the mistakes, and then use the intentional system, the rational system, also called system 2, to make the right decisions, to lead that giant hulking brute into the effective part of it. You can think of it as Beauty and the Beast. So that's kind of a good analogy of a way to think about it.
Can you touch on a couple examples?
Yes.
We don't need names of companies or people or anything like that, but just to kind of put context into this is what we're talking about. I love the story in the book. You talk about the Ohio State University, Michigan fans. I'm a Michigan fan. Most of my friends know that. I just thought that was a very interesting. But
sure.
Go ahead.
I'll start with that. So, I was giving a presentation in Columbus, Ohio, which is, of course, the home of the Ohio State Buckeyes, and our biggest rivals. So, go Bucks! Our biggest rivals is the Michigan Wolverines, as Frank says. A lot of people here in Columbus, Ohio, the vast majority of the people don't like Michigan fans. Just being honest. So this is, of course, a problem for Michigan fans. And I was giving a presentation at a diversity inclusion conference, so D&I conference, to HR experts in diversity inclusion. I was giving the closing keynote 2018 of the regional conference, to the regional HR conference. And I asked them, hey, how many of you would hire a Michigan fan? Of those people, of the over 100 people in the audience, only 3 people raised their hand. 3 people indicated that they'd hire a Michigan fan. And Frank was in the audience of the talk where I actually showed the video from the presentation. And he saw that, and it's like only 3 people say that they would hire a Michigan fan. It sounds kind of ridiculous when I'm describing it. HR experts, diversity inclusion, the HR VPs of their company, diversity inclusion experts in their company, they just really have this antipathy. And this is tribalism. This is where tribalism comes from. This is an example of tribalism. Of course it doesn't matter, for the sake of doing the work, whether somebody is a Michigan fan or somebody is a Buckeye fan. But that feeling of tribalism causes us to distrust those who we feel aren't part of our tribe or opposed, especially those who we feel are opposed to our tribe. And that is called the horns effect. So where we don't like one aspect of a person, a significant aspect, one that's important to us, like fandom, sports fandom, then we don't like that person as a whole. And vice versa. So people who are Buckeye fans would be much more likely to hire a Buckeye fan than someone who just roots for a neutral team, I don't know, Wisconsin. So they would be much more likely to hire the Buckeye fan. And that's called the halo effect, where we like other people who have components, aspects that are significant, important to us. So the halo effect and the horns effect. It works out very problematically in relationship situations, not simply in hiring. So, for example, you probably hear that I have an accent. I'm not from around here, right? I came from a small country in Eastern Europe when I was 10, called Moldova, when it was freed from Soviet domination, Russian domination in 1991. And one of the things I learned about when I was going through the PhD program is that people with foreign accents are trusted much less than people who don't have foreign accents. I wish I had dropped my accent by that time, but it's much harder to do when you're already getting your PhD, becoming a doctor. So that's 20s is too late in life to drop an accent. That's an example of where we are likely to not feel it, but we are likely to distrust that person because of the horns effect. That really harms a lot of sales if you don't know that that's what's going on, if you don't know about these things of tribal belonging that you don't realize are going on, but they very much are.
Okay, so we've got this brute of a friend, a dim-witted brute of a friend, and then we have the nerdy, more polished friend.
Yes, I like the Beauty and the Beast.
Okay, but the Beast is so fast. But how can the Beauty quell the Beast? And because that's really what you're getting at here is avoid these mistakes. It's so that the Beauty has to overcome the Beast somehow. It's
simple but not easy. So think about your experience with eating. So you talked about the restaurant, right?
Yep.
When you get, let's say, go to Dunkin' Donuts, get a dozen donuts, box of dozen donuts, it's very tempting to eat all the donuts. This is just a temptation. This is just a very strong drive for us Because in the savanna environment, when we came across a source of sugar, like apples, bananas, honey, it was very important to eat as much of it as possible. So we are the descendants of those who are very tribal and who are very strongly triggered by sugar. That's how we survived and thrived. Now, in the modern environment, it's a very bad idea to eat a dozen donuts at once. One's okay, two maybe, but you got to stop at the third donut. But once you start eating the donut, it's very hard to stop. Just like when you have a gallon of ice cream and it says, serving is a cup. Yeah, right. Who stops after a cup of ice cream, right?
Right.
So that is another example where it's very difficult to stop. And the feeling of trying to stop yourself and trying to have a healthy diet, trying to eat in a healthy way, is a way that you're overcoming some of those cognitive biases, some of those dangerous judgment errors that we have in our minds regarding your physical fitness. So you know that in regard to physical fitness, you have developed ways, hopefully, of making sure that you eat in a healthy manner. Now, you need to transfer that same combination of willpower and strategy to having mental fitness. The vast majority of people don't have mental fitness. They just, do the equivalent of eating a dozen donuts and ice cream and then watching Netflix on the couch all day. That is how they usually behave in their relationships. That's a terrible idea. It causes so much damage to your relationships when you're not aware that that's the way that you're actually behaving. That's how you're coming across. You need to learn about the dangerous judgment errors, the cognitive biases that we tend to make, and how to address them effectively. So I'll give you another example, just for cognitive bias. I'm not perfect. I suffer from cognitive biases myself. The worst one for me is called the optimism bias. Now, the optimism bias is kind of like it sounds. I think the grass is green on the other side of the hill when it's too often yellow. I'm very oriented toward opportunities and I tend to ignore threats, too much so I make a lot of mistakes. Entrepreneurs are very much like me, so I collaborate really well with other people who are entrepreneurial, because it's kind of hard to start a startup. When you start a startup, you know that about half all startups fail within the first 5 years, about 75% fail within the first 15 years. So that's pretty bad. So you have to be pretty optimistic to do a startup. And so I run a company called Disaster Avoidance Experts, Consulting, Coaching, and Training, 6 people. And I know that. Now, it's very tempting for me to work to build relationships in my workplace with other people who are like me, to hire other optimists. I feel good about working with them. I feel comfortable. I have 20 ideas before breakfast and I think all of them are brilliant, and they tell me that those ideas are brilliant. And then they tell me their own brilliant ideas and they think they're brilliant. But if I only hired optimists in my startup, we would all be running in different directions because we'd have 120 projects each day that we think are brilliant. Now, that's the way that startups fail. That's one of the biggest reasons that startups fail. They're not focused enough. They run out of cash because they're focusing on too many things that aren't profitable in a timely manner. What I need to do, and I learned I need to do this from going through studying these cognitive biases, is make sure to have some pessimists on my team. Hire people who are pessimistic. That's the inverse of the optimism bias. They orient toward threats instead of opportunities. They think the grass is yellow on the other side of the hill, even though it's sometimes green. But what happens with ideas is that I give my 20 brilliant ideas to a pessimist, and they say, these are all half-baked potatoes, but these 3 of these 20 are the least bad. And these 3, here's how we can fix the flaws in these ideas. They're bad at generating ideas because they see the inherent flaws of each idea, but they're really good at figuring out how to fix flaws, evaluating ideas, fix flaws, and then implementing them effectively. So that is a very powerful relationship combination. When you get an optimist and a pessimist together, that's a very powerful relationship combination when you need to make things happen. This is a big problem for salespeople because salespeople overwhelmingly tend to be optimistic. So how many times have you seen salespeople give, if you're a sales manager, give sales targets that are way too high, that they really will not reach these sales targets. They give high targets because they're optimistic, and you need to go against your intuitions and learn, okay, you have consistently not been hitting these sales targets because you set the bar too high. You really need to set the bar lower and figure out when you're optimistic, how do you deal with this optimism bias? And there are ways of dealing with it. So one way I mentioned is to make sure to have a pessimist review your sales targets, if you're an entrepreneur, review your plans before you go forward. Same thing. So review them before they go forward, get that external perspective. And that's an aspect of having mental fitness. You have a specific behavior that you use as an intervention before you make the decision. In the same way that you, when you want to eat healthy, you perhaps don't buy ice cream for your house, or maybe buy a gallon a month or something like that. That's a specific intervention that you can use to build up a healthy mental habit, just like you build up the healthy physical habit of having a healthy diet. Another thing that you can do that I talk about in the book, both of these, is have probabilistic thinking. So probabilistic thinking is a technique where you evaluate your ability to predict the future accurately. And so you say, hey, I will make 100 sales next quarter. Then you learn over time that, hey, you only make 80 sales. And consistently over time, you learn that you're maybe overestimate them by about 20%. Well, that should tell you that you're too optimistic by 20% or so. I mean, I'm too optimistic by about 50%. I learned this about myself and I try to correct for that. And then you can correct for this yourself. So see to what extent you're optimistic, or if you're one of those rare salespeople who's pessimistic. Very hard to find pessimistic salespeople. But if you're one of those rare listeners to the show who's pessimistic, then you figure out how pessimistic you are and correct for that. So that's another strategy. You make a prediction, you evaluate the future, and then you correct going forward.
Gotcha. Now, in the blind spot between us, you talked to a series of different biases. You just mentioned optimism, pessimism, and authority and egocentric. Are these more specific names for cognitive biases, or are they entirely different?
No, these are specific names for cognitive biases. So if you are curious about the research on this topic, and the book is thoroughly cited, it has citations to a whole bunch of academic articles. If you look at put into Google Scholar the name of a bias, like optimism bias, pessimism bias, halo effect, Horn's effect, confirmation bias, egocentric bias, you will find a lot of articles on these topics, and published in behavioral economics, psychology journals, neuroscience journals, about how our brain works and how that specific bias has come about. So those are the names, specific academic names of the biases.
Are there any of the biases more troublesome than others?
What you want to find out which ones are most troublesome for you. So I know for me, it's the optimism bias. Different people have the different cognitive biases that are most troublesome for them. One of the most frequent ones is called the confirmation bias, where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't confirm our beliefs. That's very bad. It can be very bad for entrepreneurs and salespeople alike. So I said that one of the top two causes of entrepreneurial failure for startups is startups running out of money because they're not focused enough and disciplined enough. The other biggest failure for startups is misfit of product to market. So misfit of product to market. And that happens overwhelmingly because the founder of a startup falls into confirmation bias. They look for information that confirms their beliefs about the market being there and there being a fit between what they're offering to the market. And they ignore information about the lack of product fit or too many competitors or whatnot, other dynamics that are going to be problematic. So confirmation bias, that's a huge one. Same thing for salespeople who are trying to make a sale. They're looking for information that confirms their beliefs, and they're ignoring information that does not confirm their beliefs. So they tend to believe that they'll make too many sales compared to the actual reality of sales that they'll make. And you want to, while it's great to be optimistic to motivate yourself, you don't want to be optimistic when you bring your quarterly plan to your sales manager and say, this is how many sales I'll make. I'm very confident I'll do so. Right. The same thing, when you're going to your angel investors as a startup founder and saying, hey, these are the numbers we'll make. I'm very confident about that. You don't want to do that. That is not the environment in which you want to function. So confirmation bias can be really bad. And I've seen that bring down a lot of startups and harm a lot of effective salespeople's careers.
Well, I think that's a good point to make. I have a friend who had has a business, very successful business. She was creating another arm of that business, had all sorts of focus groups asking people what they thought about the product. Doesn't matter what the product is. Based on that interpretation, she went to market, hired people, marketing, the whole 9 yards, and a year later pulled the plug on it. And I just said, well, what happened? And she said, I failed to ask the right question. I asked people what they thought about it. They said it was great, but I should have asked, would you buy it?
Of course.
And that's a more telling question. Everyone's going to say, hey, I like it. I don't want to hurt your feelings. So very interesting. I have a friend who likes to argue politics, ideology, whatever. And when I bring up the notion of that a bias or two might be tainting his view, he indicates to me that, I'm well aware of the biases, but I'm smart enough to separate my thoughts from them. Is that possible? To me, it's like, no, we're human. I don't know how you would do that, because I know myself, I have confirmation bias. As you say, you have biases.
Yes. So. Yeah, I've been studying this pretty much my whole life, and I'm still vulnerable to cognitive biases. I make sure to get an external perspective from people who are pessimistically inclined and in other ways. No, you can't get rid of your biases. There's a specific cognitive bias called the bias blind spot, which causes us to ignore our cognitive biases, certain aspects of our cognitive biases. Now, you want to understand where the cognitive biases are coming from. They're coming from our feelings. They're coming from our emotions, from our comfort with the world. So when we feel comfortable with something, with reality, and that's a reality that we would like to see happen, that's the time to be worried about things and question ourselves and build up a little bit humility about ourselves and our confidence in the world. That's a very hard thing to do. So building up confidence is a very hard thing to do. I'll give an example. If you haven't changed your mind about something seriously important about your life, about the world, about politics within the last year, that probably indicates that you're falling into a number of biases, because you're always getting information about reality. And that information should cause you to change your mind in lesser ways or bigger ways about reality. Lots of people don't. They stick with their preferred views because they feel very uncomfortable changing their minds. It feels like they're undercutting their identity. It feels like they're questioning who they are. That is a big problem, because they're basing their reality, who they are, on unfounded perceptions of the world. It's a much better perspective to have, to update your beliefs and be proud of being able to change your mind based on new information about reality. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of our business leaders and politicians, the titans of industry and the titans of politics, were the kind of people who changed their mind based on new evidence and pivoted effectively when they got this new evidence? Unfortunately, too many are not. And they are rewarded for having strong leadership, consistent leadership, being consistent. Being consistent is a bad thing. It's a problematic thing. The world is not consistent. The world is complex. The world changes. And if you don't change with it, that's an indication of a serious problem within you rather than the world.
Yeah, I tend to try to be not all in on anything. I want to just, when I hear something, I feel myself being, that's bad. I want to just say, okay, what's a different perspective on that? And it's not easy. It's not easy because like you say, we do tend to ignore information. It's like watching a sporting event. When there's a bad call against your team, two different fans can see the exact same thing and see it exactly, totally opposite. And it's all in their head. All right. The Blind Spot Between Us is your book. Two questions related to kind of wrap up. How can people listening help you? What kind of would be good referrals for you, groups you're looking to work with? How can they get a hold of you?
So the two questions. So first of all, I'm right now spending, with the COVID-19 pandemic going on, I'm spending a great deal of time revising people's disaster management plans, disaster avoidance plans. So you heard about my new book, Resilience, Adapt and Plan for the New Abnormal of the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic. A lot of people think it will blow over, and they are very much wrong. It's a big, serious problem that will be around for a while. So I'm helping a lot of people address their plans and adjust their plans, adapt their plans, and their decision-making processes around COVID-19 coronavirus. So if you know someone who might use some of that assistance, please let me know. You can find me at disasteravoidanceexperts.com. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com. There's blogs, videos, podcasts, information about online classes, webinars, consulting, coaching, training, decision aids, guides, manuals, and of course my books. Especially check out disasteravoidanceexperts.com /subscribe. There are two things there that you want to check out. There's a free 8 video-based course on making the wisest decisions in your relationships and other professional areas, and an assessment on the most dangerous judgment errors in the workplace, so cognitive biases in the workplace. So you figure out which ones you're most vulnerable to and your workplace is most vulnerable to and how you can address it. Again, that's at disasteravoidanceexperts.com /subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with me personally, I am pretty available on LinkedIn, so connect with me there. Dr. Gleb Tsipursky on LinkedIn, GLEB for you. Well, Gleb, I really appreciate your time today. This was very enlightening. Thank you very much for having me on, Frank. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AMSPIRIT.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.